At some point, you may have a business requirement to configure anonymous access for external users. To do this, you'll need to extend an existing web application. And here are some things that are going to be needed for this process. Create the web application. Extend the zone. It's still going to be one web application, but by extending it, you allow users to access via different URLs, and they'll get a different user experience depending on how they access the web application. If you need internal users to be able to access the web application to make configuration changes and such, they would access it via one URL. You may want to set this up so that internet users can access it and they would only have read access. Essentially, they're both accessing the same web application, the same content, just via different URLs, and they will have different permissions associated with that. You'll have to configure the anonymous policy, whether you're going to deny write, deny access completely. You have a couple of options there. The user permissions, are you going to allow them to use Office integration, and so on. And then, of course, you want to harden the server against attacks. And finally, you'll need to set the site collection settings. Now, on the web application side, you need to create that web application. There are different zones that can be applied to a web application, but one must be set as the default. The authenticated access needs to be the default. The default zone cannot be anonymous. If it is, it will cause other problems within the system. Search won't run properly. If you're utilizing DPM, Data Protection Manager, for backups, that won't be able to perform its backups properly, and so on. So always make sure that the default zone requires authentication. And then you're going to extend that web application as anonymous. On the Authentication Provider side of it, you're going to configure your zones. You can have up to 5 zones per web application, but no more than that. The default, when you create the initial web application, that is set at default. Granted, you can change that, but you must have a default zone. You have an intranet zone for the internal internet for your internal users. You have an internet zone. This zone is the one that we will be using to set up for anonymous access. You have an extranet zone. If you collaborate with business partners, you would set this up as the extranet. This is still going to have external access outside of your network. However, this normally will require authentication. And then you can set a custom zone. The anonymous policy. You can set that to none. There is no policy for anonymous. Deny write access makes it read-only. They will not be able to add content or to make changes. And then you can choose deny all. That means that it would deny all access for anonymous users. On the user permission side, you want to deselect use remote interfaces. And you also would want to deselect use client integration features. Once you have your web applications configured, you'll want to harden the server. On the IIS side of hardening, you want to change persistent cookies to session cookies. Persistent cookies is the default setting for an IIS website. So let's talk a little bit about that. Session cookies. These are temporary cookie files which are erased when you close your browser. When you restart your browser and go back to that site that created the cookie, the website will not recognize you. You will have to log back in if it's required, or select your preferences again if the site uses these features. A new session cookie will be generated which will store your browsing information and will be active until you leave the site and close the browser. So in other words, every time you access that site, a cookie is generated and nothing is stored on your computer. Persistent cookies, these files stay in one of your browser's subfolders until you delete them manually, or your browser deletes them based on the duration period contained within the cookies file. You also have the iUser account. This is the account that's used by IIS to authenticate anonymous users in response to requests for web content. Depending on your organization's security requirements, you might want to change this to not be the default. If this farm is designated as an external access only farm, Only enable services that are needed and turn off any unnecessary services. And for site collection settings, disable Designer within the site collection. Disable SharePoint Designer. It's designed to make modifications to the site, and it can also change the permissions, and it can do a lot of things that might grant access unnecessarily, especially if in the wrong hands. And of course, turn on auditing. Because this is an external site, you would want to track any changes that have been made to the site collection, especially regarding permissions. And then finally, enable anonymous access. And make sure to limit the number of people that have access to the site collection to make changes. Let's get started. The first thing that we need to do to enable anonymous access on our web application is to create that web application. Let's go to Central Administration. Once in Central Administration, we need to go to Manage Web Applications. So click on Manage Web Applications from the home page. And then to create a new web app, we're going to click New from the ribbon. And you want this to be descriptive in IIS, so we're just going to call it, for our demo purposes, Anonymous Internal. And the reason that the initial web application is still going to say anonymous, because this web application is designated to be external, anonymous access. Whoever is responsible for managing this site will still need to access it and authenticate. So we're going to call this Anonymous Internal. If you have the DNS, you would go ahead and type port 80 and then type in the DNS, but we're going to use a port, so we're going to type 9701, and it will use the server name. Authentication Provider is NTLM. And notice we're not going to allow anonymous at this point. It is not recommended to use the default zone as anonymous access. It will cause other problems within SharePoint and additional third-party tools. And for the application pool, we'll use Anonymous Internal also. And you want to make sure that this is descriptive. When you go to IIS to look at the application pool or to recycle it, whatever it is that you need to do, you want to be able to identify which app pool is associated to which web application. You want to make sure that you use a separate application pool account for this web application than you would for any of the other ones, because it is an externally facing site. And of course, we need to put the content database name. We can't use WSS content. We want to make sure it has something that is descriptive. And then click OK. Now, once this process is complete, we're going to take it to the next step. We're going to extend this web application, and we're going to extend it to be the anonymous zone. But before we do that, we need to have a site collection there to be able to access and to configure after we've set up the zones. So we're going to click Create Site Collection from the Application Created window. We're going to put it at the root. You should always have a site collection at the root, but this time, instead of using the standard team site, we're going to click Publishing, and we're going to choose the Publishing Portal, and you'll see the description directly below it. A starter site hierarchy for an internet-facing site or a large internet portal. This site can be customized easily with distinctive branding. It includes a home page, a sample press release subsite, a search center, and a login page. Typically, this site has many more readers than contributors, and it is used to publish web pages with approval workflows. Go ahead and scroll down and make sure to enter your primary and secondary site collection administrators. Apply a quota, and then tell it OK. It's not necessary that you have to apply a quota, but it is highly recommended to make sure the database doesn't get out of control. Okay, now that our site collection has created successfully, let's go ahead and browse over to it just to validate. So click the link that is provided. And there we have our initial zone. And remember, this is the default designated as authenticated. When we're finished, we should be able to access this URL or this site via two URLs. If you notice at the top, it's got SP 2010 SVR or SRV :9701. That's the port that's being utilized. We're going to extend this web application, and we're going to use port 9702 next time. You will most likely have specific DNS names, but for this demo purposes, we're just going to use server name port. Minimize the screen, and then click OK at the top level site successfully created. And now you can see we have our anonymous internal web application. To extend it, first highlight the web application and then click Extend. We're going to type this anonymous internet. This port is 9702, and it'll pick up the server name. This time we're going to choose Allow Anonymous. Click Yes. And then down at the bottom, before when we initially created the web application, we didn't get an option to change the zone because we needed to have that default. It has to have a default zone. We're going to click the down arrow and you can see we have an option between Intranet, Internet, Custom, and Extranet. Go ahead and choose Internet. And if you look on the left-hand side, it shows the public URL is the domain name for all sites that users will access in this web application. The URL domain will be used in all links shown on all pages. And by default, it is set to the current server name and port. And it provides a link if you would like to get some additional information. Click OK. Okay, we just created this additional zone, but you'll notice that it doesn't show up here under the web application list. The default zone is the only one that will show up here, even though we now have two different ways to access this web application. Let's go take a peek. So we're going to browse to our site. We'll expand it, and notice that it's 9701 is the port. I'm going to change it from 9701 to 9702, and then press Enter. So essentially what we have here is we have one application, but two separate ways to access it, and two separate authentication methods that users can use to access the site. Okay, and the page is finished loading, and you'll notice it's the same exact information. So if you change content on the internal side, it will automatically be reflected on the external side. There's not two separate sites here, one site, two ways to access, two different authentication methods. So let's go see how this looks in IIS. Click Start, Administrative Tools, IIS. And then expand the plus sign next to the server name and click on the plus sign next to Sites. Notice it has created two separate sites. We have an internal, and then we have the internet. And this is one of the reasons you want to make sure that you're descriptive as to how you name the sites in the application pools. But let's look at the application pool side of it. notice there's only one application pool. Both of those sites are utilizing the same app pool. We'll be coming in here shortly to do some additional configuration. But let's go back to our central administration site because we have some additional configuration that needs to be done. So let's click on Anonymous Internal. Up at the top, you're going to see the ribbon. In the middle area, you're going to see Authentication Providers. Go ahead and click on it. And it'll provide a list of the two different ones that we already have enabled. We have Default and Internet. If we click on Internet, you can validate the settings. Authentication type, it can be Windows, but we do have Enable Anonymous Access selected. Just because we've turned it on here, that does not necessarily mean that Anonymous Access is set yet. You have to turn it on at the site collection level. And if you look on the left-hand side, it says you can enable Anonymous Access for sites on the server or disallow Anonymous Access for all sites. Enabling it allows site administrators to turn Anonymous Access on. So at the site collection level, they have the option to turn it on or to turn it off, and that would apply to every site collection within this web application. You could have 20 different site collections, and only 2 may be turned on for Anonymous Access. Disabling Anonymous Access blocks anonymous users in the web config file for the zone. If Anonymous Access is turned off when using Forms authentication, forms-aware client applications may fail to authenticate correctly. So do keep that in mind if you have forms-based authentication enabled. Now, if you want the site that's external, the internet site, to be completely anonymous, you would deselect Integrated Windows Authentication. As it is now, by default, most content is set for anonymous. But if a user ventures off into a zone that requires authentication, it's going to prompt them. And if you don't want your users to be prompted at all for authentication, you would need to turn this off. We're going to leave it on for our purposes. And then click Cancel. We haven't made any changes. So let's go ahead and set the anonymous policy. On the ribbon bar, second from the end, is the Anonymous Policy button. Go ahead and click on it. Now, if we set the anonymous policy, we can choose to have it applied to all zones. If we wanted to deny to all zones within this web application, then we would select all zones and deny all. But for our purposes, we only want one zone to be able to utilize anonymous access, and we're going to choose the internet zone. The default zone will never be allowed for anonymous access. And we're going to choose deny right. Has no right access. This makes it anonymous with read-only access. If you wanted individuals to be able to contribute and so on, then you could just say no policy, and then they would be able to contribute to blogs and such. We're going to make this read-only, so we're going to select deny right, has no right access, and click Save. We also need to set the user permissions. If you look on the toolbar at the top, you're going to see an icon for user permissions. Go ahead and click on it. And these are all the different options that are available and the permissions that are allowable. The two that you're most concerned about are using remote interfaces. You want to deselect that, and by doing that, it's automatically going to deselect the item directly below it. Use remote interfaces. Use SOAP, WebDAV, the Client Object Model, or SharePoint Designer interfaces to access the website. And in the client integration features, uses features which launch client applications. Without this permissions, users will have to work on documents locally and upload their changes. And this just locks it down a little bit more, makes it more secure. Go ahead and click Save. So now that we've configured what needs to be done on the web application side, let's go look at IIS and make some changes to secure and lock down that environment. Go to Start, Administrative Tools, IIS Manager. Now the first thing we're going to do is we're going to remove everyone permissions from two particular files. So let's expand our server. We're going to click the plus sign next to Server and then the plus sign next to Sites. And we only want to apply this to the external side, to the Internet side. If we right-click on Anonymous External Site, we're going to get some options. Go ahead and click Explore. We're looking for the _VTI_PVT bin. Double-click to open it up, and you'll see 3 files in there. We want to remove everyone from both of the service files, the service and the services. So go ahead and right-click on it and go to Properties. On the Security tab, you'll see that everyone has read access. We want to remove that. So we're going to choose Edit, select Everyone, and choose Remove. It's going to tell you you can't remove everyone because this object is inheriting from the parent. To remove everyone, you must prevent this object from inheriting. So let's go ahead and tell it OK. Click Cancel, and then at the bottom, click on the Advanced button. On the Everyone, we're going to choose Change Permissions and Edit. Actually, we don't want to choose Edit because we want to break the inheritance. So click Cancel and deselect the checkbox next to Include Inheritable Permissions from this object's parent. It's going to give you a warning. If you proceed, inheritable parent permissions will no longer propagate to this object. Click Add to convert and add inherited permissions as explicit. Click Remove to remove inherited parent permissions from this object. But actually, we're going to click Add and then choose Edit. And notice the permissions that they have are List, Read, Read Extended, and Read Permissions. Go ahead and click Cancel. Highlight Everyone. Click Remove. And it is no longer in there. And then click OK to back all the way out. Now we've just done that for service. Let's do it for services. Right-click on Services, Properties, Security tab. Once again, if we click Edit here, we're not going to get the option to remove it because it is inheriting from the parent. Go ahead and click Cancel if you've opened it up, and then click on the Advanced tab. Choose Change Permissions, and then deselect Include Inheritable Permissions. If you click Add, it will make a copy of the permissions that are currently available, and it will no longer inherit. So you'll still have those permissions and you can modify what's there. If you click Remove, it's going to remove all the parent's permissions from this folder, which we do not want to do. Click Add, and then highlight Everyone, choose Remove, and then OK, and OK again. And finally close it out. And now we've modified the permissions of service and services so that everyone is no longer included. Now the next step is to change the default persistent cookies to session cookies for this particular website. So go ahead and close out the folder. And under the Anonymous Internet, not internal, but on the Anonymous Internet side, what we're going to do is we're going to change it so it's no longer persistent and it's session cookies. Persistent cookies are the default. We want to change it because persistent cookies, they stay in the browser subfolders until you delete them manually, and they contain information that you may not want contained on individual users' computers, depending on how secure your environment needs to be. Session cookies are temporary cookie files which are erased whenever you close the browser. So when you restart the browser and go back, that cookie will be regenerated. A persistent cookie is going to stay in the browser's folder until it's deleted manually or based on the duration period contained within the persistent cookies file. So if you're in a really secure environment, you'll definitely want to change this from persistent to session. So to do this, we're going to select the website that we want to change the setting for and scroll down to the IIS section in the middle panel. You're going to see the first icon is ASP. Go ahead and double click it. And you have multiple options here to choose from. The one that we're looking for is the very last one, Session Properties. And it says Enable Session State. In other words, enable session cookies. We don't want session cookies. If this setting is set to true, then it's going to be persistent cookies. We want to change this to false. We want to change it from the default of true to false. So it will no longer use persistent cookies, it will use session cookies. So every time that user closes their browsers, that cookie will be removed from their computer. Go ahead and click Apply in the upper right corner. And that's it. You're done on the IIS side. We can go ahead and close that out. And we're back to our web application. We've enabled the option for the site collections to use anonymous access within their collections. So let's go back to that site collection that we created. And you're going to see the very top link is Enable Anonymous Access. Go ahead and click on it in the body of the site. And we can specify what part of the website anonymous users can access. Do we want to give them access to the entire website or specifically to lists and libraries? If we choose entire website, it grants anonymous users the ability to browse the entire site, read any lists, libraries, or folders within a list or library that inherits permissions from the site, and open and read any list items or documents in those lists or libraries. So in other words, it's got not necessarily full control, but it has permissions to read everything within that site in the lists and libraries. If you select lists and libraries, anonymous users will be able to view and change items only for those lists and libraries that have enabled permissions for anonymous users. We're going to choose entire website and then tell it OK. Notice at the very top we have a yellow bar that goes across. Some content on the site has unique permissions which are not controlled from this page, which is perfectly fine. That by default there are some sites and areas that it's not going to allow you access to. But notice that we have an icon on the ribbon called Anonymous Access. And we can come in here now within the site permissions and modify this. And we can change it or remove it as needed. And finally, if this server is dedicated solely to be external access or this particular farm, you'll want to make sure that you disable any services that are not necessary. And if you have more than one server in the farm, the changes that we made in IIS will need to be applied to every WFE in the farm. So that way, no matter which server gets the request from the user, it'll have the same configuration setting.